There are rooms in history that don't belong to just one man. They remember who walked in, how they stood, and what they left behind. And sometimes, they judge. This story begins and ends in the same room, the Oval Office. But it's not about the desk or the chair. It's about two men who sat there, years apart, facing storms that demanded more than just power. One entered with the weight of the world's most complex financial crisis resting on his shoulders. The other walked in with a storm of his own, one made of his words, tweets, and impulse. And the room remembered. In early 2009, Barack Obama stepped into the Oval Office not as a symbol, but as a solution. The housing market had collapsed. Banks were crumbling. Millions were losing jobs every month. And hope, once his most famous word, now felt thin. That office wasn't impressed by his campaign speeches. It demanded action, calculation, restraint. It wanted proof of leadership. Obama didn't shout. He didn't blame. He listened. To the data. To economists. To the working-class letters on his desk. He asked questions no one had dared to put on the table. What happens to the man who's never bailed out? What does rescue look like for the family without a lobbyist? Every policy, every paragraph he read late at night, he rewrote with one thing in mind: consequences. Because a president doesn't just lead with vision. He leads with foresight. Years later, another man entered the same room. Donald Trump didn't face a silent financial collapse. He faced a loud, invisible enemy, a global pandemic. But instead of calming a nation, he amplified the chaos. Where Obama had once drawn strength from expert briefings, Trump tossed them aside. Where nuance was needed, Trump offered spectacle. And the room, the same room, watched as the silence of reason was replaced by the noise of division. This film isn't about politics. It's about echoes. What a room keeps. What a decision means when millions are listening. What stays behind long after a president leaves. Because leadership doesn't just occupy space, it shapes it. And in this room, two men left two very different shadows. The chair doesn't move. But it remembers who hesitated before sitting down. When Barack Obama first stepped into the Oval Office as the 44th President of the United States, the room was quiet, reverent, as if it too understood the weight of the moment. It wasn't the grandeur of the architecture or the symbolism of the eagle-emblazoned carpet that paused him. It was the chair. That chair, tucked behind the resolute desk, had once held Kennedy's caution, Reagan's conviction, Clinton's calculation, and Bush's burden. Now, it waited for a man who had risen from the south side of Chicago, who had taught constitutional law, who had walked picket lines with workers, and who had just inherited the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. And Obama didn't sit immediately. He stood for a moment, as if listening, not to the advisors around him, but to the ghosts that occupied the space. Roosevelt's wartime memos. Johnson's civil rights appeals. Nixon's silent tapes. All the decisions that had passed through this room still lingered. Obama wasn't just entering a new job. He was stepping into a dialogue with history. That morning, the unemployment rate was climbing past 7.6%. By the end of the year, it would hit 10%. The auto industry was imploding. Banks were failing with a speed that outpaced headlines. There were memos everywhere, some printed, some digital, some still being rewritten in panic by staffers trying to keep up with collapsing institutions. Obama picked up the first binder. It was the bailout proposal. The room watched. The numbers were staggering: $700 billion to stabilize financial institutions. The same ones that had played fast and loose with mortgages, that had paid bonuses while foreclosures swallowed neighborhoods, that had lobbied for deregulation then begged for rescue. The plan, crafted largely during the Bush administration's final days, was now on Obama's desk. It was legal. It was ready. It was expected. And it made him pause. He turned to his new chief of staff and asked, where's the page for families? Silence. They scrambled. They searched. But the binder wasn't built for people. It was built for markets. It spoke in the language of liquidity and leverage, not rent and groceries. Obama didn't yell. He didn't pound the desk. He flipped the binder closed. He then called for a legal pad, yellow-lined, simple. And with a black pen, he began to sketch. What if this plan included direct aid to homeowners? What if we made infrastructure spending part of the rescue? What if banks had to accept new regulatory oversight in exchange for public funds? What if this wasn't just a bailout, but a rebuild? By nightfall, the mood in the West Wing had shifted. No one knew exactly what would stay or go, but they could feel it. This president wasn't just signing what was handed to him. He was reoffering it. And then, late that evening, after hours of meetings and rewrites, Obama returned to the Oval Office. The chair was still there, waiting. This time, he sat. Not out of comfort. But command. Because for Obama, leadership was never about owning the desk. It was about earning the decisions made at it. The clock read 2:42 a.m. In the private study of the White House residence, the room was silent save for the low hum of a desk lamp and the quiet scratch of pen on paper. President Obama sat alone, his sleeves rolled, posture slightly bent over a single sheet of paper. The official draft of the economic recovery package, the one carefully calibrated by economists, advisors, and political strategists, was resting just to the side, untouched. Instead, in front of him, lay a fresh sheet of stationery, and in his hand, a pen that moved with both determination and doubt. All day, he had smiled through meetings. Nodded through briefings. But something inside him had stirred, a discomfort that had refused to be soothed by numbers and reassurances. The bailout plan, as proposed, was sharp, swift, and surgical. It would flood liquidity into Wall Street, stabilize major banks, and prevent economic collapse. But it said almost nothing to the small business owner in Ohio watching her payroll shrink. Or the Detroit auto mechanic wondering if tomorrow there would still be a factory to walk into. So the president asked the question no one else dared ask out loud: where are the people in this rescue? Now, in the silence of the early morning, he was writing his answer. He didn't call his advisors. He didn't summon a new round of experts. He wrote alone. Line after line, Obama restructured sections of the package. He inserted clauses aimed at mortgage relief. Added language to prioritize job creation programs in underserved communities. Allocated emergency funds for schools at risk of closure. Each sentence, each stroke of the pen, was a quiet rebellion against a system that too often ignored the margins in favor of the center. This wasn't about ideology, it was about balance. Yes, the banks needed rescue. But so did the bus drivers. The waitresses. The teachers. The invisible pillars of a teetering nation. Outside, the White House lawn was blanketed in frost. Inside, Obama's pen didn't shake, not from exhaustion, nor from pressure. Because for once, he wasn't writing as the president advised by 1,000 voices. He was writing as the child of a single mother who once struggled to pay rent. As the community organizer who had walked the hallways of crumbling housing projects. As the man who had learned that leadership didn't mean choosing the most powerful voice in the room, it meant listening to the quietest. He paused. Read the final paragraph again. Then signed it. As the ink dried, he leaned back. His face didn't show triumph, just resolve. He folded the new draft and placed it inside a red folder. On the top, he wrote in simple black ink. Final. This is the version we fight for. When he handed the folder to his chief of staff at dawn, no one yet knew the implications. Not Congress. Not Wall Street. Not the millions who would soon see the effects in their neighborhoods. But history would remember that night. Because in that moment, while the city slept and the market still trembled, Barack Obama did what few dared in the face of elite consensus: he rewrote the narrative. And the pen did not shake. It started with a brief silence. The kind that falls when a room realizes the center of gravity has shifted. Obama entered the Roosevelt room just after 9 a.m. The red folder, worn at the corners and slightly creased, was in his hand. Around the long oak table sat his economic team: Summers, Geithner, Romer, Orszag, faces tense, guarded, prepared to defend the version they'd spent weeks perfecting. The air smelled faintly of coffee and caution. He didn't sit. He placed the folder in the center of the table and said simply, "We're making some changes." They weren't ready. Larry Summers, always first to react, leaned forward. "Mr. President, if we delay now, the markets." "We won't delay," Obama cut in. "Calm, even. We'll revise." The new draft was passed around. Pages turned. Eyes scanned. And then came the first tremor. Not of disagreement, but of surprise. Because this wasn't a wholesale rejection of their work. The core of the bailout remained. But threaded through it were sentences that hadn't existed before. Direct funding for school infrastructure. Protections against foreclosure. A clause reserving a share of funds for minority-owned businesses. Targeted grants for community health centers. These weren't political ornaments, they were structural reinforcements. "Who wrote this?" someone asked, genuinely. "I did," Obama replied, without raising his voice. Another pause. This one longer. Tim Geithner cleared his throat. "Sir, these additions, they're going to complicate things on the Hill." "I'm counting on it," Obama said. For years, Washington had operated under a quiet logic: in crisis, save the biggest first. Stabilize Wall Street and pray the help trickles down. But Obama wasn't praying. He was redirecting. He walked to the end of the room and stood beneath the oil portrait of Theodore Roosevelt. "If we bail out banks and leave behind families," he said, "we're not solving a crisis, we're feeding the next one." The message landed. And from there, the ripple began. First, in closed-door sessions with lawmakers. When the revised package was presented to Congress, there were furrowed brows and furiously whispered sidebars. Some senators accused the administration of bloating the bill. Others said it was an overreach. But then came the data: the revised bill would create not just financial stability, but jobs. Thousands. Then millions. School districts that had prepared pink slips began rescinding them. Foreclosures slowed. In cities across America, new signs popped up, funded by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The ripple spread to the media. At first, cable news fixated on the spectacle. Obama rewrites the rules. President overrides advisors. But when the numbers started to move, the tone shifted. Editorial boards once skeptical began to ask, could this be the new model of crisis leadership? Even Wall Street, after its initial irritation, came to understand the long game. A recovery that lifted demand at the ground level meant consumers. And consumers meant business. What had begun as a point of contention became a blueprint. But perhaps the most powerful ripple wasn't public. It was personal. In a neighborhood outside Phoenix, a single mother kept her job because her school received emergency funding. In rural North Carolina, a veteran opened a small repair shop with one of the new small business grants. In Detroit, a laid-off factory worker enrolled in a community college thanks to a job retraining program Obama personally insisted on. None of these people knew about the red folder. But they felt its impact. Years later, a former staffer would say that something changed after that meeting in the Roosevelt room. Not in policy, but in posture. Obama had always been deliberate. Measured. But from that morning on, he moved with something else too, conviction sharpened by consequence. He had seen what a single night could do. What a pen in a quiet room could unleash. And so had those around him. It wasn't just the recovery that began that week, it was the redefinition of leadership. Because while others had prepared to rescue the powerful, he chose to restore the people. And that choice echoed, through the halls of Congress, across struggling towns, and deep into the next generation of public servants. In that sense, the ripple never stopped. It simply reshaped the room.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that move the world. Thanks for watching.